This week, the embattled African state of Zimbabwe has held presidential elections. The person claiming victory is Robert Mugabe, who has been president for quite a while. So I thought before we get into reports from The Guardian on the election, I felt it would behoove us to get a little bit of background information about who Robert Mugabe is, because a lot of Americans, I don't think they would necessarily know. So he is the president of Zimbabwe. As one of the leaders of the guerrilla movement against white minority rule, he was elected into power in 1980. So it was sort of a kind of Nelson Mandela situation in that sense, where he was a fighter for, against these kind of apartheid regimes, and then he came into power after they'd fallen. The thing that he was lucky in is that Zimbabwe's apartheid regime, or white minority rule, fell 10 years before South Africa's did. But he first rose to prominence in the 1960s as a member of ZANU, which was an opposition party fighting for, black liberation, essentially. During the conflict against white minority rule is when he, rose into prominence. He was a political prisoner due to his political activities from 1964 to 1974. He emerged from prison as a hero in the minds of many Africans, and he won the first election in 1980 where blacks were allowed to participate. Unfortunately, once, blacks were allowed a place in government, what happened was the two factions, which they weren't even that different ideologically. They were both just like Nelson Mandela's party prior to independence. They were Marxist organizations. It's just one was pro-Soviet Union and the other one was Maoist, and they could not come to any sort of agreement as to how the country should be run, even though they were fairly close ideologically in the big picture. So unfortunately, these two groups split and they started killing each other. And, this civil war erupted all over Zimbabwe. And following the death of thousands, neither faction was able to defeat the other, and the heads of the opposing movement reached a landmark agreement where they created the party that is in power now, which is both parties combined, and it's called ZANU-PF. So this merger, in a sense, can be seen as a good reconciliation move, but people have also criticized it as a step towards one-party rule. And actually, in reality, that's really what it has been for a lot of the time. Since 2000, the Mugabe-led government embarked on a land reform program intended to correct the inequitable land distributions created by colonial rule. The period has been marked by the deterioration of the Zimbabwean economic situation. It was well known that in the 2000s, Zimbabwe had, if not the worst economy and the worst devalued currency, then very close to the bottom of the list. Of course, Zimbabwe is not an ally of the British or American governments. It receives a lot of criticism from them and sanctions. And in 2008, Mugabe's party suffered a tight defeat in the parliamentary elections, which is the first time that had actually happened. Annika, what is your opinion or view on former colonial regimes, maybe, under the thumb of apartheid white-only governments that put in place land reform once they come to power?
Well, I have interesting feelings about Mugabe, period. I mean, he started out so wonderfully.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now he's a thug, in my opinion.
Yeah.
He election tampering, intimidation, busing people from other districts in.
Ghost voting, taking boxes and dropping them on the side of the road, yeah.
Yeah. So I have big issues.
Yeah. But about land reform specifically, do you think it's a valid way forward for African nations emerging from white dominance?
No.
No? Okay.
I really think that land reform, it's an issue, yes, but in reality, I think they're using it as an excuse to, not cover some other issues.
Well, yeah, and the sources that I've read also, I do think land reform is essential, but at the same time, I think these regimes, 20, 30 years on, they're still using that issue to stay in power. But also, it wasn't just simple. While there was some positives to his land reform program, and that did have demonstrable benefits for the poor. But at the same time, I would ask, why did you do it 20 years after you got in power? I don't understand why it took him from 1980 to 2000 to do it, number one. And number two, like I said, I think it's used more as a rhetorical and election device than actually.
Absolutely.
And also, his family owns 3 farms. How do you think he got that land? Land reform. So it's not like this is just some beneficial thing, I mean, it's not a one-sided issue, but at the same time, unfortunately, this land reform program.
I mean, he's kind of playing it both ways.
He is playing it both ways, yeah. Yeah.
That's the best way to put it.
So to go into a little bit more of the short clips of the history, so both of these rival Marxist factions were banned in 1964. As I said before, he was imprisoned for 10 years. While in prison, his 3-year-old son died from malaria. And he petitioned to be allowed out of prison to attend the funeral in Accra, but was refused permission by the white minority ruler, Ian Smith. So I think it was things like that, being in prison, not being able to go to his son.
I don't have a problem with that. You're in prison for a reason.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
just because something happens that's good, bad, whatever, you don't get let out of prison. You're in prison.
Well, he was in prison because he was the government was cracking down on black activists.
Well, but again, if that's what the government is doing, why would they turn around and let him out? It doesn't make sense. And if there was, think of the resources for every prisoner that had something happen. You can't do that. You just can't.
But he was able to escape the country. He went to Mozambique, assisted by a Dominican nun, where he was placed in protective custody.
Yeah. If you look at, Nelson Mandela was a terrorist.
He was, yes, back in the day.
Right, and that's why he was in jail. And whatever wonderful guy he is now doesn't change the fact that he was a terrorist.
Well, I don't think that... he was... Well, he was a... he was a terrorist because the government of South Africa at the time, the Apartheid regime, considered him a terrorist.
Right, but the ANC at the time, they did acts that were horrible. People were killed. I'm not, he's changed a lot of his situation, but the point is he was a terrorist at one point. So,
in the eyes of the apartheid government, yes. But anybody who even as much as spoke out against the apartheid regime was targeted. And it was the same way in Zimbabwe as well.
Absolutely, right. But, and there are other ways of doing things. But, Mandela did a lot more than just speak out. And this guy did a lot more than just speak out. But it doesn't matter. The fact is that's ancient history.
Yeah. It's in the past.
He's been the president and the prime minister. And now look at what he's doing.
Mugabe?
What he's doing now is horrific.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, even with, that argument that there are other ways to do it is so hard. Number one, in countries where you're not even recognized as a citizen or as a person with rights. But also,
I know.
I know you know that, but it's also, it's so, that message that you don't have to resort to violence is so hard to get across to people when, even with the ANC's, revolutionarily violent techniques, it still was not able to end apartheid until 1990. So think of if they would have just, just been sort of a Gandhi-style kind of peaceful activism, who knows when apartheid regime would have ended.
I understand that, but sometimes it can backfire. So
sure.
The violence makes people even hate you even more.
And there was a lot of bloodshed in that period, yes. Yeah, that's true.
Like I said, I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying there were bad things that happened in the past. My issue is that he might have been the victim,
all the parties agreed on a new constitution for a new Republic of Zimbabwe in 1980, and that started the modern state of Zimbabwe that we have today. But within 3 years, what at first seemed like a very promising sort of democratic system, you could say, just 2 or 3 years later, the military under Robert Mugabe was crushing armed resistance. It was crushing opposition. And a expose by the BBC program Panorama actually accused him of committing mass murder during this period of his rule. How do you think he's still in power if he has really done all these things?
Well, there's election tampering. That's one of them.
Yeah.
And these are people that have seen so much violence that I think part of it that they're opposed to seeing more.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of it. I really do.
And it's just kind of normalized.
Yeah.
So what is it about Africa that continually cranks out this kind of tin pot dictator?
Well, Africa historically was tribal.
Correct.
A lot of different tribes, and it's a very large place.
Yeah.
And tribes, it's the one place that really, I think it was more tribalized than any other place in the world.
Yeah.
Is that they kind of, once they get their power, it goes back into that clan mentality.
He was influenced by this person named Julius Nyerere, and to Nyerere, democracy was a detraction that colonialists would use to destabilize newly independent countries. And Mugabe, that's what he believed. And Mugabe was convinced of this. Is this statement that democracy is just a kind of colonialist contrivance, is that valid?
I can understand how they might see it that way, because the democratic colonial, governments that own their countries, that they were a colony of. So a lot of them can see democracy as the old regime.
Yes.
And it scares them.
Yeah.
So it's valid in that. He's 89, believe me, years old.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he's vote rigging and he's politicking, and it's like, step down already. You've had your time. You're old.
Just give it a rest.
Retire.
Yeah. Yeah. But I could understand
that's what convinces me that he does not have good intentions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because, the reasons that the fact that he's not stepping down and is doing all the vote rigging and the
Yeah, and he's not even stepping...
traveling and all that.
Yeah.
If he was really loved and winning on his own volition, I could see it.
Yeah.
But the fact that he's cheating to win at 89 years old, he is just totally power hungry.
After having, 30 plus years of power already.
Yeah. He is just, he is completely narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah.
Just takes over.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, going back to this democracy as a colonialist contrivance, I can understand how that would be convincing, but I can understand how that would be more convincing in the 80s. How is that so kind of something that has political currency now?
Oh, it doesn't. It's an excuse.
Yeah.
That's all. It's an excuse.
Yeah. Going back to the 80s, another controversy that erupted in the 80s, in addition to that BBC Panorama program, is the fact that that within Zimbabwe was a North Korean army training camp. They signed an agreement to jointly train their armies in June 1980. Why would Zimbabwe find North Korea to be an ally? Yeah.
They took the communist side. Now, maybe it was part of what we were going back to with the colonialism and democracy.
And North Korea was seen as anti-colonialist, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so maybe it goes back to that, or it goes back to thinking, if World War III is going to happen, who do you think is going to win? We want to get on their side early.
Yeah, yeah.
For a while, it really did look like Russia had amassed more weapons than we had.
Yeah.
And it looked like they were more ready to use them.
Yeah, and so it really could have been just...
the nukes that were going to be lobbed were not going to be going to Africa.
Yes.
So if you're training with Korea and they're busy swapping nukes at each other, you've got this great communist training. You can now go out and conquer the rest of Africa while everybody else is fighting their own wars. And you will have a better capability of achieving your goal because you have trained with this. But the North Koreans were trained by the Russians.
Yes, and the
top of the world training you.
But also, to a big extent, the Chinese too.
Right. Well, the Koreans were just more vocal than the Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah, well, China was active in Africa in the Cold War. And if you look at the times, this is kind of going on a tangent, but it's bizarre because I think it was the 50s, the Soviet Union and Communist China were natural allies, obviously. But they had a split in the 50s, or 50s or 60s, and at that point, they really ceased being any sort of working relationship at all. And it's so weird because when you look back at these sort of Cold War proxy wars, China would intervene in some of them, in Angola, in Mozambique. Also, well, there were some others as well. I think Namibia as well. But China would intervene on the side of the capitalists and the side of the United States because they disliked the Soviets so much, and that's only come out like 20 years later, but it's really strange to think that was the case, But so going back to this, so I see how this, alignment with North Korea really could be a shrewd power play on Mugabe's part.
Absolutely. And if he even survives the rest of his term, what's going to happen next? I mean, is he going to continue doing this? Basically, he wanted to be president / prime minister for life. For life, yeah. And he's doing anything he can, legal or not, to continue with that. It's really sad. Yeah. What it comes down to, he is a dictator.
Yeah.
Just not in name, but he's a dictator.
Yeah. It goes on to say Zimbabwe's 5th Brigade killed between 10,000 and 20,000 people. The report also notes that about 2,000 of these people were killed within the first week of the deployment of the troops. So you see this kind of thing in Africa more so than other places. Why does something like this not happen in the U.S., do you think?
Because the fact is we're not a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Why? There are too many checks and balances. We're a first world country. That's why it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
We have journalists, we have freedom of speech. They're on top of it, and they are never going to let this happen.
Yeah. Yeah, to this gross extent. Yeah, I agree. So in terms of economics, during the 1980s, Mugabe's policies were largely socialist in orientation. In 1980 and 1981, the Zimbabwean economy showed strong growth of the GDP. From 1982 to 1989, economic growth averaged just 2.7%. So it fell greatly after that first few years in power when the sort of persecution began, which would make sense, If a people are terrorized, of course they're going to stop being productive. Then later on in the 90s and the 2000s, unsuccessful market reform attempts started and the economy stagnated in this time. Since 2000, GDP has declined by roughly 40%. Do you think that, for more socialist societies, that market reforms are always a good choice in all situations?
Nothing is ever good in all situations. There are always exceptions to the rule. Words like never and always.
Well, the World Bank and the IMF take that stance.
I know, but I'm just saying that's my thing.
Yeah, okay. And the World Bank did publish a report on Zimbabwe in 1995 saying that Zimbabwe, after independence in that initial period, Zimbabwe gave priority to human resource investment and support for smallholder agriculture. This expanded rapidly, and social indicators quickly improved. From 1980 to 1990, infant mortality decreased from from 86 to 49 per 1,000 live births. And immunization increased from 25% to 80% of the population, which is really impressive for Africa. Life expectancy increased from 56 to 64. And by 1990, Zimbabwe had a lower infant mortality rate, higher adult literacy rate, and higher school enrollment than average for actual developing countries that, were their contemporaries. In 1991, things changed, though, because the government was short on hard currency and under international pressure. They embarked on an austerity program, which is something the IMF goes into these third world nations and encourages. The World Bank explained that such reforms were required because Zimbabwe was unable to absorb its labor market. They graduated from its impressive education system. Those could not be those could not be absorbed into the labor market. The reforms, however, undermined the livelihood of Zimbabwe's poor majority. The poor were forced to live on marginal lands, as Zimbabwe's best lands were reserved for mainly white landlords. The white landlords were a sector of the economy favored by the IMF's plan. This is pitiful, but according to the World Health Organization, today, life expectancy at birth for Zimbabwean men has become 37 years old and 34 years old for women, the lowest figures for any nation in the world. The World Bank's 1995 report predicted this decline, commenting on healthcare system cuts mandated by the IMF Structural Adjustment Program of austerity. It stated that the decline in resources is creating strains and threatening the sustainability of health sector achievement. So that's really sad that, at least, his case as a leader is made worse in the fact that he didn't stick to just one path. He was, pursuing this socialist program for 10 years, then he completely reversed course, and of course that destroys an economy. If the United States were to become...
And it destroys his credibility, too.
And his credibility, because it looks like he's waffling and he has no ideals, But also, if we were to just, that was what happened with the Soviet Union,
I don't
too.
think with him it's waffling, because he just changed it once and did it. I think he had a view until he got into power, and then once he was in power for a while and knew he had that base, he decided to do what he really wanted to do.
Yeah, and it's also, it's at the end of the day, I don't think he even really cares about ideology. He doesn't have any strong political beliefs, besides his own, personal well-being.
It's power. It's all power hungry.
Yeah, and it's really like, if it's like when the Soviet Union collapsed and market reforms were brought there. The first few years of, what we have now, modern Russia were dreadful. You can't do this sort of change all of a sudden. Like if the United States all of a sudden, this would never happen, but all of a sudden tried to become a socialist economic system, that would be disastrous, just because you need to understand that, and a good leader understands that change can be radical, but change has to happen slowly. A society cannot absorb just overnight, bam, but for one of the good things that has come out of this is, fortunately, Zimbabwe still does have a literacy rate of 90%, which is the highest in all of Africa. So that is one good legacy of Mugabe's rule. But of course, while he may invest in education, he has also engaged in policies that are blatantly against the poor. He is engaged in the mass bulldozing of poor housing. And the UK's Daily Telegraph has reported that his latest palace, which I guess he has more than one palace, which is dreadful, is in the style...
power and,
Yeah.
Anyways.
His latest palace is in the style of a pagoda, located a mile from these destroyed shelters. That's just awful. But then again, I don't know if it's really that surprising. One of the more dreadful things, just to add into here, is back when the civil war between these two Marxist groups was raging on, the first election, he did win. However, I think, was it the first election or the second election? In his first election, he did win, sure. But he also said that if he did not win, the civil war would continue. You're really not giving people a choice there, because who wants to see civil war rage across their country? That's an awful thing to do.
Yeah.
It's just terrible. It really shows that he has no regard for the well-being of his nation. So in terms of
he doesn't. He hasn't. All he cares about his own well-being.
Yeah. And in more recent elections, foreign journalists have been harassed or arrested, including a correspondent for the New York Times. And according to the Washington Post, in 2008, he was ready to resign. But his military advisors, who I guess would have a lot to lose, convinced him to remain in the race. Blah, blah, blah. Of course, the opposition, headed by Morgan Tsvangirai, he is heralded by the West. But of course, his slate is not clean either. According to the Sunday Mail in the UK, this opposition party is training youth activists in violent tactics in South Africa. So that's not good either, and that delegitimizes them as well. And also, Zimbabwe has arrested 100 of its own officials and polling officers after the first round of the elections. And this isn't any sort of just normal voter intimidation situation. People were actually intimidated, sometimes with rape. So, this is just horrific.
Oh, yeah. Intimidation happens all the time with everything.
Yeah. He accuses the UK of pursuing a policy of regime change. And, the West says he's an extremely poor role model for the country. What do you think a good role model for an African leader would be?
Look at Mandela.
Yeah.
He's a great role model. He has done nothing slimy, nothing illegal. He won a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah. Well, Barack Obama also won a Nobel Peace Prize. Don't be misled.
Well, it's not for the right reason. So is Al Gore, for crying out loud. But, yeah. But Mandela won it when Nobel still meant something.
Yeah. Yeah, which actually, wasn't that long ago.
Before Nobel pulled out.
Now it seems they just give them to... who was this? Someone that was ridiculous who was George W. Bush was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. What?
Al Gore, really? What did he get one for?
But at least Al Gore didn't invade any nation.
Al Gore didn't do anything peaceful. He made a climate change movie.
I know, you're right. But George W. Bush is really the outrageous one. But, so, as I said before, Mugabe's party, the party that has ruled since its merger with its rival faction in 1987, ZANU-PF stands for Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front. For the first time in 2008, they lost the parliamentary election, but I think it's looking like from this, quote-unquote election, whether you see it as legitimate or not, it seems like they will come back to power. They're a party founded on the ideology of left-wing nationalism and Marxism-Leninism, but I think really, especially under Mugabe, they just sort of jettison any ideals they have to stay in power,
Yeah.
Officially, they have a socialist ideology, and they are modeled in communist parties in other countries. However, it's abandoned much of its egalitarian principles associated with conventional Communist Party practice, instead choosing to pursue a mixed economy. Like we were talking about earlier, do you think that's just because really at the end of the day he's now just pursuing what he really wanted to do?
Absolutely.
So now let's, done with that background information, going into this article from The Guardian, which says, Zimbabwe elections free and fair, says Robert Mugabe after casting vote. Do you believe Robert Mugabe?
Oh, yeah, free and fair. Mm-hmm.
Do you believe him?
No, not in the slightest.
And it's so weird because there's this one almost surreal. This is a surreal picture with this article. It's him casting his vote. He has this just smug look on his face that just reads, I know I'm already going to win this. Absolutely. And there are people behind him just beaming, taking pictures of him on their cell phone cameras. It's like, how can people still be enthused?
they're not necessarily enthused, but
He's a celebrity.
Sure, the celebrity status, exactly. Like if I saw Paris Hilton, would I take a picture of her? Yeah, probably.
If only to send it to me.
Send it to you, exactly.
Yeah, you're right. No matter how your leader is, if you see him, it's still a big event.
Exactly.
So it says Robert Mugabe was
especially if you see him and survive after his secret police don't get you.
Well, yeah, and these people were like 2 feet away from him, so that's probably rare as well.
Yep.
You know,
I'm sure they were all cleared and vetted before they got near
probably, but also, you think about it, for one of the poorest countries in the world, these 2 people are privileged enough to have a cell phone with a camera. So they're probably associated with ZANU-PF, you know. But it says Robert Mugabe was in a jocular mood as he cast his vote in Zimbabwe's elections on Wednesday, talking to reporters.
Showing they voted, yeah.
You know, he is Africa's oldest leader. You know,
89, he's probably the oldest person in Africa. Well,
you know,
Mandela, and then him, and then like the whole rest of Africa.
Yeah, right. I mean, he's 89 in a country where the life expectancy is under 40.
It doesn't matter. He already won. I mean...
Yeah, and there is speculation that should Mugabe prevail, he will step down before his 90th birthday and hand power to one of his allies in the ZANU-PF.
Oh, yeah, but he said no. He said absolutely not.
Yeah, I think people are just thinking, how much longer can he really go, you know?
He said, well, one journalist asked would he was serve a full term, and he goes, why not? Don't you want me to serve the whole term?
Yeah, that's true. So I don't know who is speculating this. I guess because they just think he's going to die. Mugabe had support from Kelvin Mudzing, a 23-year-old electrician. He says, Robert Mugabe is the only person who can stand for us. We're the younger generation, and we need someone with a sense of where we're coming from. We should keep him as long as he's willing to serve. What is his appeal?
He really understands someone that's old enough to be his grandson. The world has changed so much in Zimbabwe.
Yeah. What is Robert Mugabe's appeal to some people?
That if they vote him, he won't kill them.
I shouldn't be laughing at that because that's awful. But you don't think there's pretty much anybody who earnestly...
No, that's probably part of it.
Yeah, it probably is. Because, he certainly has the power.
That's a lot of what it is. I honestly think so.
Yeah, because, Yeah, this person says, continues, the 2000 election was a bit tense. There was a lot of violence and people were afraid. And this other person said Mugabe deserved to be honored, but his time is up. We feel the old man should rest now. ZANU-PF ministers say that victory is certain. Interesting. How could they know that victory was certain, Annika?
Because he bought the election, essentially.
Yeah, well, and did other things. It finishes up, Mugabe has refused to allow Western observer missions to monitor voting, but the African Union and Southern African region also have thousands of observers present. To wrap up, what are any of your other thoughts about not only Robert Mugabe's legacy, but moving forward? He has claimed victory. What do you see as the future for him, his country, and ZANU-PF?
I think the future for him is death fairly soon. For the country, I think they really need to recover.
Yeah.
They've been so messed up for so long with what's gone on and the turmoil there.
Yes. Looking back on it, in those first few years, maybe 1980, 1981, his administration really had potential. Zimbabwe's standard of life really increased because for the first time, the black majority was treated as people, really. Education was very strong. He has the highest literacy rate in Africa. And those are all good things, and they should not be minimized. However,
obviously, he trained with the South Koreans, they had influences on that.
Yeah, yeah. And that should not be, those positive things should not be discounted. However, obviously he's made more than several, not only missteps, but actually very violent and belligerent and just dictatorial things. I mean, he is really, whatever legacy he had coming out of prison as a hero, he is tarnished. And he tarnished it within 3 or 4 years. He trashed it. And it's unfortunate that he couldn't just rule for, even 10 years is a long time in democracy, in democratic terms. If he could just go until 1990 and just give up, then he could at least rest on his laurels. Instead, he is artificially extending his rule, and it's not good for his reputation. It's not good for his country. It's not good for anybody, except his, I guess his power lust or whatever. Why do you think he needed to resort to these dictatorial policies to stay in power?
When he thought things might be declining, he didn't even give it a chance to decline.
Yeah.
He just did it.
And probably if he had stayed his earlier course, he probably would have been able to be legitimately elected back. Instead,
Absolutely.
He had this sort of narcissistic, like you pinpointed, this narcissistic personality that was driving him to maintain complete control and not even give up an ounce of control to the democratic process.
Yep.
As far as ZANU-PF, is it a totally discredited organization, or can some sort of candidate who actually has, socialist or communist or whatever, real ideals, can a person actually rise up through that party and re-steer the country? Or is ZANU-PF completely discredited?
Look at Mandela. He did it. It's the more difficult path. I honestly think they've been discredited to the point of, honestly, they need to, even if they just change the name of the party and nothing else.
Yeah. They need to just have a new start, for sure. And I wish, if this will be the last word for this today, but I think ZANU-PF, they had potential, just like Robert Mugabe. If they can actually recommit themselves to their ideals, if they even have any ideals, then I think that they can survive. However, if they're like Robert Mugabe, who's just willing to jettison his ideals when it suits him, then they have no future, and they need to step aside for somebody who does actually have some values for their country, which is so in need, That's pretty much it. It's looking like Robert Mugabe, it will still be in power. So Zimbabwe will linger under him for a little bit longer. It's really sad. It's really sad. I guess until he dies, at this point.
Yeah, and then hopefully he won't have someone that'll just come in and take over. Hopefully they'll be able to hold, real free and open elections.
And see, the concern is, Robert Mugabe is so old. The concern is that actually a lot of the power is not even vested in him anymore. A lot of it is the military.
Right.
The military's so strong. So who's to say that when he dies, the military can't just immediately place a strongman in the presidency?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Neither of us have the solutions to Africa, because Africa in itself is of a problem. And, Zimbabwe's a basket case. But, as always, this was a wonderful show. You provide hard-hitting analysis and a necessary perspective, and I appreciate you being here. And I know it was very
you're
late.
The optimist. I'm the realist/pessimist. So.
But I don't think you always hew to pessimism, I think you have a very fair and balanced perspective, in the real sense of the word, not the Fox News sense of the word.
There you go.
So I know that, you have a lot of stuff to do, but you know what you could really use with your cleaning, staying up all night? You could really use some crystal meth.
There you go. Where can I get some? You have some extra, Jacob?
I actually have none, but, just to the west of here.
What good are you then?
I know. What good am I? Well, hopefully my good is to help people learn about some of these issues that they don't hear about in the mainstream media. But
and believe me, my dogs will get up from the bed and wake up when I start moving and start attacking each other again, and that will keep me up.
So you'll have a riotous a riotous, fun night of cleaning. So thank you very much for being here. And
thank you for having me again.
thank you for the listeners, our threes and fours of listeners that are out there on the internet. Thank you very much, and we will speak to you next time. Oh, and by the way, this episode of The Word is dedicated to Giggles the Fawn. Rest in peace.
Absolutely. Rest in peace, Giggles.
Okay, bye guys.